Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe and explore. They noticed it first as a silence, one that didn't belong in the data. At 3:22 a.m. Universal Time Coordinated, the Chilean array transmitted a flagged segment from a passive deep-field scan. Not an error. Not a dropout. The region beyond the Virgo supercluster hadn't simply gone dark. It had ceased to respond altogether. Not black, not opaque. A patch of sky returned nothing. No scatter, no redshift. As though the stars had simply given up the act of being seen. In South Africa, the SKA team ran a correlation check, assuming a sensor drift or solar interference. But their array registered the same absence, down to the decimal. Coordinates locked, a perfect arc of erasure etched into the cosmic background. Shape too exact. Boundaries too clean. Nature, even at its most violent, doesn't draw lines like that. The circle held its form across all frequencies. Microwaves stuttered at the edge. Radio signatures bled into static. Infrared returned no heat, though the surrounding void brimmed with the thermal residue of dying galaxies. Not this zone. This zone wasn't dead, it had never occurred. No alarms sounded. No headlines. Just a flurry of midnight emails between observatories, most using words they'd never typed into official logs. Words like unease, like void. One team at the Max Planck Institute used a different term. Not blind spot. Not obstruction. Repulsion. Within a week, every high-powered lens on the planet pointed toward the same quadrant. Light refused entry. Particles reversed spin. Spectrometers drew blanks across wavelengths that had, until then, been the most stable in the universe's resume of constants. An intern in Tokyo noticed the circular region never aligned with any galactic filament, never intersected cosmic microwave irregularities. Perfect isolation. Unattached to gravity wells. Nothing to lens it. Nothing to bend it. Just a mouth carved into the map, not swallowing matter, swallowing definition. Rumors spread in silence. CERN requested telemetry. The Vatican Observatory asked for raw logs. Independent amateurs on Reddit began seeing references to the silent sector before it vanished from public sky map. Coordinates delisted. An internal bulletin at the European Space Agency warned staff against speculative language in documentation. A senior physicist in Geneva sent a one-line message to her colleague in Cape Town: "Do not stare too long. There's nothing to find." Time itself did not distort near the anomaly. Clocks ran. Pulsars pulsed. But signal delay grew unpredictable. Observers described it like listening through fog. Not dense. Not thick. Just the sense that something stood between the wave and its meaning. The zone remained still. No expansion. No shrinkage. Always the same exact span of darkness with a circumference precise to a trillionth of a second arc. Like a decision made and never unmade. On the seventh night of active monitoring, a technician left his console early. Not out of fear. Not confusion. Just a moment where the screen stopped mattering. Where the silence didn't feel like a gap but a presence. He couldn't explain why. No one asked. By the eighth day, the algorithms started returning zero variance data from within the circle. No fluctuation. No decay. A perfect digital zero replicated across instrument. One technician joked in passing that they'd finally found peace. The joke didn't land. Over the next week, the discussion shifted. Not what was there, but what it wanted to be hidden. The object, or absence, began attracting less technical analysis and more human withdrawal. Logs went unreviewed. Eyes glazed over during meetings. At one observatory, a physicist asked aloud whether they were still looking at space or something beyond the meaning of looking. The most sensitive instruments never blinked. They fed the same results, pristine and cold. But for those reviewing them, something began to press back. Not fear. Not awe. Just a quiet retreat of the mind from thought itself. As if the act of analysis disassembled the very capacity to do so. The void did nothing. It sat in the data like a verdict no one wanted to read aloud. The decision to escalate came quietly. No press releases, no statements, just a quiet approval in overlapping committees to begin the photon entanglement trials. Spectroscopy had already failed in every standard configuration. Emissions readings returned nothing, not even the statistical noise that accompanies dead space. Radio sweeps passed across the boundary and died mid-broadcast. Transmission halted without echo. It wasn't absorption. It was cessation. The entangled systems were different. They were built not to push through space, but to reflect interaction between locations, pairing behavior across impossible distances. A station outside Stockholm received the first burst. Split photons routed through beam splitters, entangled in spin, distributed through quantum keys. As expected, one particle was sent toward the anomaly's periphery. The other remained on Earth, isolated in vacuum. Something in the dataset refused to close. Not delay. Not misalignment. A noise pattern emerged between entangled states, subtle shifts in phase that shouldn't exist, as if the measurement registered without ever being made. It wasn't interference in the classical sense. There had been no environmental crosstalk. Shielding was intact. Calibration confirmed. The system had been clean. The second trial failed faster. Observers reported the entangled particles losing correlation moments before the outbound stream reached the anomaly's border. Not drift. A clean severance. No probabilistic curve. Just a cut. A third trial introduced redundancy. Triple redundancy. Multinodal observation, machine vision only. Human involvement was reduced to input approval. Despite the insulation, a strange echo replicated through the control interface. Symmetry errors in the test matrix. The error logs described impossible symmetry, where simultaneous measurements produced inverses that cancelled before registration. By the sixth experiment, the test team had stopped talking during launch. Not from superstition. Just quiet. One physicist reviewed the control run. The experiment conducted without entanglement. A baseline. No photons sent near the anomaly. Nothing should have occurred. Yet the data revealed the same anomaly. Fractal interference in time-lapse across the measurement logs. Identical to the tests where photons had been dispatched. No external force. No participant. Just behavior. By now the data tables looked less like science and more like confession. Mirrors folding in on themselves. Each observation subtracting itself from memory. Readouts behaved as if an answer had already been guessed and removed. There was a moment in the control room, not recorded. A single breath held across terminals. Not shared. Not spoken. Just a pause where no one moved. Not out of fear. Not out of awe. Just a moment where something unspoken passed between those present. This was not a mistake in instruments. The silence in the results began mirroring the silence in the room. On the next test, the detectors inside the Earth-based array began recording collapses milliseconds before the entangled twin was even directed toward the anomaly. Prediction? Influence? Some suggested retrocausality. Others stopped using words with time in them. A younger analyst noticed a pattern. The interference mapped something. Not a shape. Not a signal. A rhythm. Consistent across trials. 4 peaks, 3 valleys, followed by absence. No repetitions. No loops. No origin. Just emergence. Reviewing recordings at midnight, the lead technician noticed something strange. In the reflection of her console screen, her lips were moving before her thoughts formed. She switched off the monitor. The silence felt cleaner. Weeks passed without improvement. Every new setup produced the same results. Measurement before intent, collapse before observation. As if the anomaly wasn't a point in space, but a condition. A demand. One morning, the entanglement chamber locked. Not physically. Nothing jammed. The sensors refused to initialize. The diagnostic read, system ready. But nothing began. No human touched the interface. Still, the cycle completed. Logs updated. Data recorded. The experiment ran itself. Reviewers found the final readout disturbing in its lack of anomaly. Pure data. No interference. No collapse. As if nothing had happened. As if the system, having registered attention, chose not to repeat its mistake. No one ran another test that week. Some spoke of burnout. Others cited technical limitations. But quietly, in private channels, more than one team lead admitted a creeping sensation, not of fear, but of being watched backward. As if the anomaly had observed them watching it, and changed its shape accordingly. There were no conclusions. Just fewer eyes turning to that part of the sky. Not from reluctance. Not avoidance. Just the sense that continued observation would return less than zero. Not absence of knowledge. The removal of the ability to form it. The decision to use human cognition came from frustration. Data had failed to yield meaning, and meaning had begun to fail the people reviewing it. So the next move leaned into direct interaction, not through signals but through minds. Cognitive-linked probes weren't designed for deep space. Originally developed for coma patients and advanced neurofeedback therapy, the system paired quantum entanglement with live cortical mapping. Thought patterns could guide drone telemetry. Not commands, intention. No speech, no screens. Just direction, drawn from subconscious pattern recognition. The prototype was hastily retooled. A chair. A shell of ceramic plating. A cap lined with sensors and polymer electrodes, light enough to forget but tight enough to press down just enough to remind. Everything around the subject stayed quiet. Temperature neutral. Lighting low. Heart rates monitored in silence. On the first session, no movement registered from the probe. But the operator's vitals dipped after 7 seconds. Breathing slowed unnaturally. Not fatigue. Not trance. Muscles remained tensed, but the eyes didn't blink. Not once. When the session ended, there was no recall. Not amnesia. No memory to retrieve. The technician described it as walking into a thought that had no inside. The second subject lasted longer. 9 minutes of clean output. Brainwave spikes matched the probe's erratic drift near the anomaly's perimeter. No commands had been given. No prompts. Still, the vehicle rotated twice, pitched and froze. The operator cried without knowing why. No sadness. Just water down the face. When asked what he saw, he used only one word. Nothing that required translation. Just said it twice, as if one attempt had not finished forming before the next began. The third session was different. The connection began normally. Pulse locked. Oxygen stable. But midway through the probe's approach, the display panels lit with dense, unreadable data. Not random. Not gibberish. Structure without language. Spacing that resembled syntax but refused to stabilize. Symbols that collapsed under inspection. No one spoke while watching. No alarm sounded. But the operator's mouth opened. Remained open. No sound. No breath. Eyes wide then still. Medical staff broke protocol to extract her. She returned to baseline after 6 minutes, physically unharmed. But for the next 3 days, no words left her mouth. No gesture matched her intent. She attempted to write. The pen scratched lines that crossed without meaning. Aphasia, said one report. Transient. Stress-induced. But something lingered beyond language. Her silence did not feel like injury. It felt chosen. By the 5th trial, another anomaly emerged. The probes began recording data before sessions began. Pre-session timestamp. Movement logged without prompt. The operators hadn't connected. But the interface lit anyway. Activity in the absence of interaction. The systems ran in isolation, air-gapped, no external triggers. Yet input occurred. Identifiable patterns, mismatched to any prior session. Brainwave noise mapped over empty profiles. One technician reviewed the data overnight. Noticed something in the waveforms, a drop in amplitude at intervals matching REM cycles. But the subject hadn't been asleep. Hadn't been near the facility. He checked the control logs. Reviewed biometric archives. The timestamps aligned with her home's security footage. She'd been staring out a window. No dreams were remembered during the sessions. Some operators described the absence as restful, others disquieting. One man refused a second attempt, not out of fear, but because he said it left him unable to miss anything. As if nothing had ever been there to begin with. The anomaly did not respond to commands. It did not push back. The probes did not transmit interference, static radiation. But with each connection, more was lost. Not data, not equipment, but something harder to define. The will to ask another question. The desire to trace another pattern. A soft fatigue that seated itself behind the eyes and hummed without sound. By the 10th day, 2 operators resigned. Another stopped speaking except in numbers. Sequences that didn't repeat. No one decoded them. No one tried. It no longer felt urgent. What was left of the team stopped reporting intent. Sessions were logged with single lines. Attempts with no description. The data grew cleaner. Smoother. Until, without announcement, one probe ceased all motion 5 kilometers from the anomaly's edge. Final log entry recorded no commands. No override. Just one unchanging metric. Orientation locked toward the anomaly, communication open, no signal returning. Silence, again, from a silence that had never asked to be heard. The shift didn't come with an event. No malfunction. No alert. No single moment of failure. It arrived beneath recognition, beneath protocol, beneath language. Technicians began missing timestamps during routine log reviews. Not overlooked. Deleted. Minutes not remembered. Pages of logged code reviewed without comprehension, eyes moving, hands scrolling, but nothing held. One noticed she had underlined the same string of telemetry across 3 separate nights. Same pen. Same margin. No memory of doing it. Others complained of pressure behind the ears, like barometric change before storms. Some brushed it off as fatigue. One man chalked it up to screen strain. But the headaches clustered. Not random. Only those who viewed the anomaly's telemetry directly. Raw logs. Not video. Not analysis. The numbers. Dreams broke apart first. Descriptions ranged from static to silence. Not nightmares. Not disorientation. Just a loss. A sleep that arrived without sequence or symbol. One subject reported 8 hours of blank awareness. Not unconsciousness. Just absence. Waking with the sense that something had been expected but refused to arrive. Memory errors surfaced next. Not forgetting. Rearranging. Technicians found themselves repeating tasks already completed, opening the same folder 3, 4, 5 times. One researcher submitted a report already filed 6 days prior. Identical wording, identical formatting, different file name. When questioned, she offered no defense. Simply stared at the printout, uncertain if it belonged to her. An independent audit flagged inconsistencies across global archives. Instrument logs desynchronized by fractions of seconds. Quantum timestamp drift beyond hardware tolerances. A review team discovered that segments of the anomaly's data, unaltered, uncompressed, displayed rising entropy. Not in thermodynamic terms. In information structure. Coherence decayed without interference. Patterns unraveled across static tables. Sequences lost shape in place. Language within the logs changed subtly. Descriptors warped. Null became mute. 0 variance recorded as undecidable. In one dataset, a line repeated 31 times before it collapsed into a blank field. The repetition hadn't been coded. Physiological effects spread beyond lab staff. Administrative personnel reviewing metadata reported migraines after exposure. A janitor collapsed after glancing at a telemetry screen left active overnight. Medical review found no neural anomaly. But his handwriting, once clean and square, had shifted over 3 days into tight, looping scratches. He claimed to have no memory of learning cursive. Debriefing protocols changed. Screens restricted. Data scrubbed to visual representations only. Even then, operators began speaking more slowly. Thought lag increased. Eyes lost focus during explanation. Words came halting, not from fear, but from misalignment. A neuroscientist from Norway published a classified memo describing what she called cognitive redshift, the mental equivalent of spectral loss. As objects recede in space, light stretches. She believed thought, too, could stretch, slow not in time, but in meaning. Words extended beyond their anchors. Symbols detached from shape. The mind kept speaking, but the message no longer arrived. Attempts to synthesize anomaly data into machine-readable summaries failed. Summarization algorithms returned recursive errors. AI models built for pattern detection stalled. Not from overload, from absence of internal context. A loop with no entry. The term cognitive horizon appeared in the next round of communications, a point beyond which thought failed to organize. Not loss of memory. Loss of capacity to assign structure. Like watching architecture melt while walking through it. The anomaly hadn't moved. Not expanded. But the region of effect, the psychological footprint, began registering outside direct observation. Teams reviewing third-hand logs. Auditors scanning paperwork. A clerk handling drive backups began referring to her own notes in the third person. When asked about it, she replied she didn't remember writing them, so they couldn't have been hers. No damage to hardware. No fault to isolate. The anomaly had not sent signal. It had not altered mass. It simply existed in record, and in record, unmade the shape of comprehension. More subjects began showing signs of linguistic fatigue. Questions were answered with unrelated phrases. Metaphors failed. Synonyms dried up. A linguist reviewing archived transcripts of the experiments described the tone across all reports as decaying into single-axis narration. Not robotic. Just flat. What remained was still called data, but the meaning of that word began to slip. Not because the numbers changed, but because those reading them no longer felt sure what counted as change. The silence deepened. Not in sound. In cognition. Something had crossed the distance between the anomaly and the observer, not with noise but with erosion. And where language failed, nothing rose to replace it. The anomaly began to draw in more than light. Not through gravity. Not through pull. It reached by proximity, not distance. A presence that required no movement to be close. Redshift values on surrounding stars remained stable. Galaxies continued their drift. But quantum sensors near the boundary showed spectral distortions with no cosmological cause. Particles slowed without mass. Wavelengths stretched without motion. Instruments recorded these anomalies with precision, but what stood out was not the numbers. It was where those numbers began to appear. A research platform in orbit above the void carried a controlled biological payload. No windows. No visual systems. Sealed environments. The animals had never been exposed to anything but sterile containment and regulated temperature. At the start of the observation cycle, baseline readings held. Within 36 hours, irregularities began. EEG patterns, once sharp and predictable, slumped. Not chaotic. Not noise. A flattening. Bursts of activity thinned to long, shallow waves. No trauma. No chemical cause. All vital signs remained within range, but something in the brain rhythms had lost direction. Like music with only one note played over and over, stretched beyond recognition. In one compartment, a rat sat motionless for 5 hours. Breathing normal. Eyes open. No attempt to move. When the cage door opened remotely, no reaction. Not fear. Not interest. Stillness unshaped by instinct. A separate subject, non-mammalian, presented no behavioral symptoms but showed identical EEG trends. Gradual decay of variance. A reduction in frequency across all regions of the brain. Commands issued via conditioned tones failed to elicit any motor response. A follow-up showed no neural degradation. No signal loss. But the response had been hollowed out. As if the capacity to respond had been preserved only in shape, not in substance. Time dilation was ruled out early. Local clocks remained synchronized. Pulsar reference points unchanged. This was not relativistic. It did not affect machinery. Only minds. On Earth, mirrored trends began appearing. Not in subjects. In observers. Review teams tasked with monitoring brainwave telemetry struggled to complete sentences. Not confusion. Not obstruction. Simply distance between thought and speech, stretched too far for comfort. Some described the sensation as thinking underwater. Others reported a loss of sequence, knowing what they meant, but no longer able to hold the order of its delivery. No slurring. No stutter. Just a gentle erosion of syntax, where speech began to sound like memory already fading. One technician whispered that it felt like being erased in advance. Not by force. By permission. Analysis flagged a recurring anomaly in the data. Brainwave frequencies exhibited redshift. Not metaphorically. A literal shift toward lower energy state, like the wavelengths of distant galaxies. But these weren't galaxies. These were living minds. Neural pulses migrating downward, as if pulled by a gravity that did not act en masse. The term was first used in a draft document never submitted, cognitive redshift. The author left it in the margin, circled twice. The rest of the page was blank. Another report noted that dreams recorded in sleep labs adjacent to telemetry hubs ceased to follow symbolic patterns. No faces. No places. Just movement without context, described by one subject as walking through fog that had learned to forget what fog meant. The orbiting lab was shut down remotely after one of the primate subjects entered a catatonic state while staring at a blank wall. No screens. No sound. No exposure to anything but air and silence. Its final recorded EG line didn't flatline. It faded, still measurable, still functional, but spread so thin it could no longer return coherence. Not silence. Just a brain that had forgotten what a thought should be shaped like. What remained was not damage. No trauma was visible in tissue scans. No lesions. No inflammation. The minds were intact. But where once there had been signals, there were now shadows of them, echoes pressed so thin they no longer touched. A physician reviewing the data whispered during a late-night consultation that this was not disease. It was distance. Not of space. Not of time. But of meaning. And what had reached across that distance had done so without moving. Without force. It had simply been there, and in being there, left them less able to recognize what thought used to feel like. The launch was silent. No ceremony. No announcement. Just an outbound signal logged, coordinates verified, and the ship released into alignment. Its designation, Tantalus Vector, carried no symbolism in the logs. Only those who'd reviewed the source myth noticed the name. It wasn't discussed. 5 aboard. No civilians. No external feeds. Mission protocol restricted external broadcast to onboard AI compression, relayed in delayed packets to ground observatories. The trajectory intersected the anomaly's periphery at an angle designed to skim without breach. Proximity, not penetration. Observation, not interaction. Every variable calculated. Every error margin tightened. No belief in error remained. Early footage returned clean. Instruments stabilized. Cabin temperature held. Crew moved with calm efficiency, each motion logged without redundancy. One recorded a system check 3 times without realizing. Another reached for a cup that hadn't been placed yet. No alarm. No notice. Roughly 14 minutes into transmission, movement ceased. No warning. No sound. A freeze without collapse. Not mechanical. Not frozen. Each member upright, eyes open, posture preserved. One stood mid-sentence, mouth parted. The footage recorded no fear. No distress. Just the absence of adjustment. Vital signs transmitted as normal. Blood pressure held. Respiration continued. Brainwave monitoring, however, flatlined, not into death, but into quiet. No spikes. No dreams. No REM. A sleep without structure. e.g. lines as smooth as open ocean, undisturbed. Attempts to prompt interaction failed. Remote commands were acknowledged by the ship's systems. The crew did not respond. No struggle. No disobedience. The silence held. An emergency override was issued 72 minutes after the last known human motion. The vessel's onboard AI initiated a return trajectory without deviation. Docking completed automatically. Retrieval teams boarded in full containment suit. What they found held no visible trauma. No sign of internal failure. Muscle tone intact. Reflexes absent. Pupils reactive to light. Limbs warm. No rigor. No stiffness. But no interaction. Speech absent. Gaze unfixed. Medical examination revealed full organ function. Nutrient levels balanced. Circulatory rhythm unchanged. But neural scans failed to locate active cognition. Cortexes lit with passive charge, but no motion. No loops. No spikes. No storms. A physician placed a hand on one subject's chest. Breath deepened. Eyes remained blank. The response did not return. One technician watching from behind glass later described the crew as statues of the living. Not asleep. Not awake. Preserved in form. With no presence behind the skin. Attempts at stimulation, auditory, tactile, chemical, produced no measurable change. No defensive flinch. No dream state escape. The mind had not shut down. It had stepped out. Neurologists used the term cognitive nullity. Not coma. Not damage. A condition without precedent. Electrical signal existed, but without pattern. Each brain an unstruck instrument. The last feed from the ship was a cabin shot. One crew member sitting alone, facing the anomaly through a sealed viewport. No voice. No message. Hands clasped. Eyes forward. The angle did not shift. But the telemetry shows the brain ceased all rhythmic activity 3 seconds before the eyes stopped blinking. Every frame confirmed it. No panic. No seizure. Just an end to motion in the body before motion in the room. What returned to Earth could not be called corpses. They aged. They processed nutrients. Their lungs expanded with oxygen. Their hearts beat. But they did not speak. They did not sleep. They did not recognize their names when spoken. Each body responded to touch with warmth. Each head turned with assistance. But no thought returned. No spark ignited. They remained like that. Unbroken. Undisturbed. The shape of awareness preserved, emptied of its function. The ship was quarantined. The telemetry blacked from public record. The anomaly was not blamed. No cause was declared. But something had occurred in the space between what the mind was and what the anomaly refused to allow it to be. And in that gap, thought had fallen through. Not shattered. Not erased. Just gone. The maps changed first. Not in appearance, but in meaning. Coordinates held. Grids aligned. But something inside the data no longer connected to what the grids were meant to represent. Boundary lines lost certainty. Contours blurred. Not visually. Conceptually. It became harder to say where the anomaly began, because the concept of beginning had started to fail near it. A research group working out of Reykjavik published a classified report proposing a reframing. The anomaly was not absence. Not massless. Not void in the traditional sense. It did not pull matter inward. It drew something subtler. The model called it a cognitive vacuum. A horizon across which thought ceased to maintain coherence. Not silence. Not compression. A loss of organization. Like heat bleeding from metal, not through temperature but through the unraveling of structure. A quiet subtraction of pattern. Meaning unthreaded from memory. Perception unstuck from language. The term entropy was redefined in that document. Not the disorder of atoms. The disorder of concept. Symbolic entropy. Where repetition replaced recognition. Where form endured but utility broke down. They introduced a framework, one that measured signal degradation not by energy loss, but by interpretive decay. Transmission lines near the anomaly still carried voltage, still returned clean checksum result. But the data received, though identical in code, began to lose semantic weight. A string of numbers meant for orbital telemetry was processed as musical notation by one parsing system. Another interpreted the same string as thermal sensor error. No hardware malfunction. No software update. Only interpretation failing under unchanged input. Language showed similar drift. Internal logs within translation software misclassified syntax. Subject-verb relationships dissolved. Gender markers reversed. Temporal verbs collapsed to neutral. Across linguistics labs, researchers noted that pronoun usage began to flatten. Descriptions of location defaulted to generalities. Specificity resisted formation. A psychologist conducting interviews with personnel exposed to proximity telemetry noted that subjects frequently paused mid-sentence, not from hesitation, but from the absence of the next word. Not forgotten, not delayed, simply gone. The sentence unfinished not due to fatigue, but because it no longer possessed an edge to rest on. Maps tracked the anomaly's influence, not with lines, with probability shift. Observatories plotted the zones where entropy and cognition exceeded baseline by more than 2 standard deviations. The radius grew, not abruptly, but persistently, each measurement larger than the last, never decreasing, always expanding with a confidence that settled into quiet disbelief. Terms once used casually, pattern recognition, associative recall, symbolic translation, acquired weight. They were no longer assumptions. They were functions under threat. Simulation models began to show predictive behavior where data input yielded outputs indistinguishable from random noise. No correlation. No regression. Algorithms built to adapt refused convergence. They didn't crash. They simply stopped learning. Not frozen. Not jammed. They plateaued with a kind of resignation, as if the effort to form meaning had exhausted some internal will not program to exist. A theorist from Kyoto submitted a white paper, short, almost skeletal, stating that the anomaly had created a field in which cognition itself unraveled. That the erosion was not of brain function, but of the framework required for brains to describe the world to themselves. Symbolic logic broke first. Pattern-based categorization followed. Then sequencing. Then time-order processing. Not physically. Not neurologically. Cognitively. One researcher, reviewing data from the outermost edge of the mapped radius, whispered that she could feel her thoughts soften when reading numbers too close to the boundary. She stopped parsing digit. Started seeing shape. Not geometric. Not abstract. Just curves, lines, absence. She used the word melt, but not in the physical sense. Another began seeing mirrors in words. Palindromes in phrases that weren't. Repetitions where none were written. He tried to transcribe them and found the keyboard misaligned beneath his hands, even though his eyes confirmed it hadn't moved. Within 3 weeks, the entropy radius increased by half an astronomical unit. Beyond sensor range. Not a sphere. A growing zone of interpretive decay. Not a force field. Not a wave. Just the edge of understanding slipping backward through the minds that tried to define it. The map could still be drawn. The points still plotted. But meaning had become the casualty. And what remained was form without function. Symbols without memory. Thought still possible, but each one smaller, quieter, less complete than the last. The question of naming became more urgent than understanding. Without a classification, there could be no response. But every term proposed collapsed under scrutiny. Not for lack of evidence, because of it. Each attempt to define the anomaly began to break the person making it. Some called it a quantum singularity of epistemology. A point beyond which knowledge itself could not pass. Where measurements ceased not through obstruction but through dissolution of the frameworks required to measure. The analogy held briefly, until those repeating it began misplacing definitions, mixing metaphors, forgetting the origin of their own comparisons. Others described it as a naturally evolved sensor. Not artificial, not designed, not intentional. A process, like erosion or mutation, manifesting not in biology or geology, but in cognition. A boundary grown not out of aggression, but out of necessity. Not to punish. Not to protect. Simply to limit. Religious groups framed it differently. Some declared it a divine interdiction. A veil drawn over a place not meant to be perceived. A silence imposed by design. Not a void, but a prohibition. They found comfort in that interpretation, though their leaders spoke less often as the anomaly's reach spread. Sermons grew shorter. Scripture recitations slowed. In the final weeks of recorded broadcasts from one monastic observatory, prayers gave way to silence, sustained for hours. Not meditative, hollow. Those who worked closest to the anomaly's telemetry began showing signs of dissociation. First in speech, answers drifting off, sentences ending without verbs. Then in behavior, repetition without intent, tasks performed out of sequence, not out of confusion, but without any visible awareness of their own order. Medical evaluations remained inconclusive. No clear pathology. No trauma. Just a shared reduction in engagement. Faces grew neutral. Interests faded. Technicians who once argued over minor equations stopped asking questions altogether. One man stared at a rotating globe for 6 hours without blinking. When asked why, he replied only once. He said the movement made more sense than anything else that week. Sleep became shallow. No one reported nightmares. But no one remembered dreams. Subjects woke with the sensation that something had been attempted in the night, an image, an emotion, a pattern, and failed to arrive. One researcher described her nights as a hallway with doors that refused to open. Another stopped sleeping entirely and did not complain. Among philosophers brought in to advise on classification, a kind of quiet detachment took root. They began using fewer words. Long treatises gave way to bullet points, then fragments, then diagrams no one could explain. One produced a single sheet of paper marked with a circle. No label. Just a faint impression of motion, sketched and crossed out. Public debate collapsed faster. Forums once filled with speculation went blank. Comments reduced to symbols. Articles reused language from earlier drafts, as if new sentences had grown too difficult to form. One headline read nothing more than "It is still there." No article followed. Those exposed to the raw data for extended periods developed a kind of inertia in conversation. Words delayed. Eye contact dropped. Not out of fear. Not resistance. Something else. Like attention refusing to stick. One analyst described it as trying to pick up soap underwater. No grip. No texture. Just the sense that something had once existed where now only outline remained. A conference held in Geneva to determine global terminology ended early. Not from argument. From absence. Delegates left without voting. Not in protest. Simply left. The anomaly continued to exist without name. Without consensus. No model held for more than a week before language around it began to erode. No metaphor lasted through peer review. No explanation escaped retraction. There remained one final shared symptom among all long-term observers, a growing disinterest in communication. Not avoidance. Not isolation. Just a gradual closing down of speech. The loss of any felt need to speak. As if thought no longer required translation. Or as if thought, in its older form, had ceased to be possible. What remained was not silence. Silence still held shape. This was the refusal of shape. A collapse of knowing not through ignorance, but through something more complete. A subtraction of the structures that made ignorance possible in the first place. The anomaly was still there. But fewer eyes turned toward it. Not from fear. From forgetting what questions had ever mattered. The threshold protocol was not born of confidence. It was born because no other path remained. Observation failed. Contact failed. Thought itself faltered beneath the weight of proximity. This would not be an attempt to understand. It would be an attempt to touch. The vessel carried no crew, no voice, no eyes. It was not built to report emotion, only correlation. Its mind was not singular. Within its systems lived layers of recorded cognition, entangled memory strands harvested from human subjects at their moment of greatest clarity. Simulated thought loops pulsed through its architecture. Not intelligence, resonance, echoes of decision and memory, repeated into structure. Its trajectory was calculated with precision. A shallow angle, skimming the outer edge of the anomaly's reach. Not entry, proximity. Enough to trigger response. Enough to receive whatever passed for reply. Its broadcast systems were triple-layered. Redundant storage across quantum and analog format. Logs encrypted and mirrored to avoid symbolic drift. At launch, the feed was clean. Initial telemetry confirmed trajectory. Internal diagnostics reported stable loop coherent. Memory strands pulsed in rhythm. Human simulations initiated with phrases from ancient languages. Not for content, for pattern recognition. The assumption was that structure would matter more than meaning. Within 14 minutes, the first degradation appeared. Not in code, in rhythm. Loop patterns began desynchronizing. Not failure, not noise. A dissonance, small at first. A breath misplaced. A pause that arrived early. Simulated personalities continued their cycles, but began repeating fragments too early, or ending before the sentence reached shape. By minute 19, one memory loop ceased completely. Not interrupted. Not corrupted. Simply missing. The system did not register it as loss. The absence did not flag an error. It became the new baseline. Broadcasts arrived with minor delay, still within acceptable variance. Ground teams noted no panic. No fluctuation in temperature or signal strength. Only a gentle thinning of coherence. Sentences began arriving without grammar. Meaning reduced to syllables. Emphasis wrong. Tempo unnatural. At minute 24, the feed split. A double stream appeared, both claiming to be primary. The first continued the mission log. The second transmitted a single tone, modulated into short staccato pulses. Not binary. Not Morse. Not musical. A pulse like someone knocking on the inside of a window with a rhythm that did not expect an answer. Minutes passed. Signal degradation increased. Logs from within the vessel showed internal simulations attempting to reinitialize. Failures unacknowledged. The ship's systems no longer recognized the concept of loop integrity. The final intelligible broadcast arrived at minute 28. The log showed a voice, or something shaped like one, uttering 5 syllables. None belonged to any known language. They shared no root, no common vowel distribution. When mapped spectrally, they formed a spiral, not visually, but in waveform, like a voice attempting to remember how speaking once worked. The last line received contained only breath, not speech. A hiss rising in pitch. Midway through the sound, the carrier dropped. The systems did not crash. They did not fail. The signal continued, but what arrived was absence wearing the shape of transmission. All backups contained the same silence. No redundancy recovered additional data. The logs had not been erased. They had never formed. Final diagnostics showed no hardware failure. No overheating. No breach. The ship continued its course. Guidance held. Systems remained active. But nothing answered. Nothing recorded. The last mark on the feed was a timestamp. No log. No context. A moment without event. A breath held, waiting to become thought, never released. From that point forward, the vessel remained in transmission range, but sent no message. Only power signatures. Only motion. As if something inside it remembered how to move, but no longer remembered why. The directive arrived and signed. A plain notification routed through internal network. Access to the region's coordinates had been suspended. Not due to error. Not as a precaution. It was labeled final. Public databases updated in silence. Star charts redrawn with an empty sector. No footnote. No warning. Just a correction. As if the space had always been empty. As if the anomaly had never needed a name. The system that logged the final expansion displayed no abnormality. No sensor fault. The radius increased by exactly 0.04 astronomical unit. The update passed through 6 verification layers before submission. No one questioned the figure. No one attempted to confirm it independently. Within days, monitoring staff across multiple sites began requesting psychological leave. Not for trauma. Not from stress. Just a kind of weight that no longer responded to sleep. Reports described memory hesitation, thought drift, a sense of subtraction. One request simply read, "I do not belong in language anymore." Those who had reviewed the latest telemetry showed the same pattern. Reduced engagement. Loss of initiative. Not fear. Not confusion. Only a quiet detachment, as if the world had flattened behind glass. They spoke in short answers. Sometimes only nodded. One removed every mirror from her apartment and did not explain. Attempts to resume study failed. Not through interference. Through disinterest. Systems ran. Screens held their light. But no one returned to them. An astronomer in Melbourne deleted 5 years of notes without backing them up. Another in Quebec removed the anomalies tag from a master database, then stared at the empty field for over an hour without typing a replacement. Discussion ceased across forums. Archived footage was removed from public access. When mirrored files surfaced, they were downloaded but not opened. No further models were submitted. No simulations attempted. The silence, once a subject of curiosity, had become a condition. The final transmission was not a message. It contained no code, no pattern, no signal. Only blank space logged at the moment of the radius update. Not corrupted. Not deleted. Pure absence. The system recorded the timestamp. The space between pulses stretched beyond system thresholds. The stream was not interrupted. It continued, empty, continuous, uninterrupted. There was no attempt to recover meaning. Not because it had failed. Because meaning had become unnecessary. Requests to restore public access were never filed. Archived permissions expired without renewal. Memory faded without grief. Curiosity dissolved without resistance. The sector remains unmarked. And those who remember what was once there have stopped describing it. Not because it was forbidden. Because description no longer reaches that far. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.